Welcome to the video on defending. Now that you have an idea of how to attack and capture pieces, it is equally important to understand the other facet of chess, how to properly defend. Like any great sport, whenever a game of chess is played, one side is the attacker and the other side is the defender throughout the course of the game. There are 5 main ways to deal with one of your pieces being attacked. The 5 ways of defense are moving your piece away, protecting the attacked piece, capturing the piece that is attacking, interposing or blocking, and finally, counterattacking. So we're going to go ahead and take a look briefly at each of these 5 examples. So the first one is arguably the simplest, moving away. This is the most basic form of defense, and it's going to be the technique that you use most often when you are first starting out playing. Okay, so taking a look at this position as a start, for example, you will see that the queen on e3 is threatening to take the knight on c5. So from the black perspective, in order to defend against this threat, black has a number of options of how to move this piece away from the attack. Okay, so thinking about how a knight moves for a second, remember it moves like an L shape, 2 squares and 1, any combination. So in this specific situation, you will see that the knight has a number of squares to move to, and during a game, you will have to decide which square or squares it is okay to move it to. And often that is just determined by which squares can that piece be safe and not be taken. So in this case, looking at the board, the knight could be taken if it were to land on any of these 4 squares. Okay, so that pretty much leaves, as far as options for where to move the piece, any of these squares would be a better option. All right, so besides moving a piece, we're going to move on to the next way to defend, which is protecting the piece that is being attacked. It's important to mention 2 things here. Number 1, when considering a defense in chess, there are often going to be times where there are multiple ways to defend a given piece, and in that situation, there might not always be one clear, correct decision. You could be faced with a decision where there are multiple options of defense, and you have to pick which one you think is best. Okay, so this is very important. In most situations, actually, there may not be one best way to proceed with defense. Okay, and the second point is, when thinking about protecting pieces, remember that you must recall the piece's point value. Okay, because obviously, if you are defending a very valuable piece via attack from a piece that is worth fewer points than it's not a good idea to allow that trade. So you would want to move that piece out of the way instead of just simply protecting it. Okay, so for example, in this example that you see on the board, the rook on d5 is currently attacking the bishop on b5. All right, so the rook, worth 5 points, is worth more than the bishop, worth 3 points. And for a quick refresher, remember that the pawn is worth 1 point. The knight is also worth around 3 points. And the queen, the most powerful piece, is worth 9 points. All right. So in this position, you have some options. This piece on b5 is attacked, so you, as black, have the option to move it somewhere, right? So when considering where you can move it, you obviously just have to consider all possible legal moves and decide which place may be best or which places may be safest. But for the purposes of this example, see if you can figure out how to protect the bishop on b5 that is being attacked. The answer is knight to a3. Okay, so what this does is you are moving another piece to defend this bishop on b5, because now, if white were to capture on b5, black would simply take back with a knight, and who benefited from that trade, right? The white rook worth 5 points versus the black bishop worth 3 points. So black would actually benefit from that exchange, and so in that case, it's okay to protect the piece. Here's another example where, again, there could be multiple options. See if you can find the two ways that black can adequately protect this knight on c5, which is, of course, being threatened by the queen on e3 currently. The two answers, hopefully, you came up with are either rook to c8 or rook to g5. Once again, remember that protecting a piece just means you are bringing another piece to the piece that's attacked's defense. All right. So in this case, either rook to c8 protects this knight, or rook to g5 does the same thing. And this is kind of cool, right? Because not only is the rook defending the knight on c5, but the king on f6 is defending the rook on g5. So this defensive harmony kind of goes together. But again, remember, when you're faced with these decisions in a game of chess, and of course there are going to be more pieces on the board most likely, there's not going to be one correct answer necessarily. So you can also, if you so choose, decide to move the piece. Okay, so here's a classic example where, yes, you can protect it, or you can think about moving it somewhere. And again, you just have to go square by square and see if you can determine if one or more squares are safe to move to. And that could be a fine idea as well. All right, so last example of protecting. See if you can find the two examples here that involve defending via protecting. The answers, pawn to b4 is one, and the other, which involves moving the attacked piece to a protected square, is knight to c4. All right, so pawn to b4 anchors this knight on the a5 square, so that if the black queen were to capture the knight on a5, white could simply take the queen back, and this would be obviously a trade that benefits white because the black queen is worth way more than the knight. All right, or if you choose to move the knight to c4, this also works, because notice that the pawn on b3 is protecting the knight on c4. Okay? In this specific example, if you were to move the knight, notice that c4 is the only good square for the knight to go. If the knight were to move to either b7 or c6, this would not be good because the black queen could simply take it for free. All right, so in this case, only pawn to b4 or knight to c4 are the two options that will save you here. Next, we're going to move on to the technique of capturing. Okay, so another form of defense is you can take the piece that is actually attacking you. And here is a classic situation where it really matters whose move it is, right? Because obviously, if it's white's move in this position, white can simply take this knight on c5. Correct? It's just hanging there. But if it's black's move, now black can take the piece that's attacking him on b3. Okay, pretty simple. you're beginning to see, hopefully, the number of layers that goes into proper defense, because besides capturing the piece that's attacking you, you could also protect the piece on c5. How? Pawn to b6 would do the trick. Again, the knights obviously are worth equal value, so a trade is a trade. Seems pretty equal here. Or, of course, if you don't want to trade in any form, you can decide to move the knight somewhere. Take this position as an example. If you were focusing on the technique of capturing the attacker as the form of defense, what would you play here as white? The answer, bishop takes f6. Hopefully you identified that the black knight on f6 is threatening to capture and take the rook on e4. So it's important to remember that just because this rook can't capture the attacker, another piece maybe can. Okay? Or once again, if you so choose, there's nothing wrong with simply moving the rook somewhere. All right. So now heading into maybe the more trickier ways of defense, whereas moving the piece, protecting it, or capturing it are probably going to be the easiest ways that you learn how to defend when you're first starting out. As you get better and better, these techniques will be quite useful and come in handy. The first one, interposing or blocking. So this is defensive technique number 4. All right. All that means is that when you have a piece that is attacked, you put another piece or pawn in between the line of the attack and you break it up. Okay? Consider it like a shield, almost. So in this case, looking at the white side of things, first identify what piece is being attacked. Hopefully you see that the bishop is attacking the queen on g2. And when thinking about blocking or developing a shield, what can that possibly mean? Well, the answer here, very simply, is pawn to e4. Okay? So you're just putting another piece, or in this case a pawn, in between the line of attack, cutting off the connection between the attacker to the vulnerable piece. That's all it is. Nothing more complicated than that. A tactic that kind of goes with interposing and blocking, along with the final one, counterattacking, is the idea of clearance. All right? And this is a situation where you are actually forming a line of defense indirectly to a piece that is being attacked by moving one of your pieces out of the way. So how does this work? Here's a perfect example. Okay, so in this situation, you see that the queen here on a5 is attacking both the white queen on c3 and the white knight on a3. But in reality, the only vulnerable piece that white has to worry about is this knight on a3 because it's hanging by itself. The queen on c3 here is being protected by this pawn on d2, which would just be an even trade, right? So the only vulnerable piece that white has currently in this position is the knight on a3. Okay? Now, of course, as you've already learned, you can move this piece somewhere. Nothing wrong with that. Okay? You can also take and capture the piece that is doing the attacking. In this case, it's going to be an even trade. Nothing wrong with that. However, the final technique that you must learn, the one about clearance, pawn to b4. Okay, so what is this doing? Well, what it's doing is it's opening up a line of connection where the queen is now defending this knight, whereas, check this out, a move before it was not. So this pawn is cutting the connection between the queen and the knight, and all we're doing is moving that piece, in this case a pawn, out of the way to make that connection. All right, so now, if the queen were to take on a3, of course, white would simply recapture back, And this exchange would benefit white because, of course, he's getting a queen, and black only got a knight out of that exchange. Another example of clearance is something like this. All right, where in this position, there is a clear best move. All right, so you've seen through all the examples I've shown so far, there are positions where there are, potentially multiple good moves. But in this case, there is only one. So think about what you would play from the white side here and see if you can come up with the correct move. The answer is pawn to f5, using the technique of clearance. So how would we come to this decision? Let's walk through it together. All right, so step one always is to, do your scan, identify, okay, are any of my pieces vulnerable to attack? And you'll see here that in this case, white's knight on h6 is under direct attack via this queen on e6. And if I don't do anything about it, that knight's going to be a goner next move. Okay, so if I'm looking to move that piece somewhere, how would I do it? Well, I only have 4 options, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. But hopefully you notice that all 4 of those squares won't work because the queen will simply capture the knight the moment it moves to any of them. All right, so in this case, the only way to defend the knight on h6 and successfully hold everything together for now is pawn to f5. So check out what you're doing. You're opening up a line of defense from the bishop on e3 to the knight on h6. So it's protected now. All right. So clearance is basically using the concept of protection, but adding a little wrinkle. A little more complicated, right? Because here, if I just were to ask you, would the black queen want to take the knight on h6, you would say no, right? Because the bishop on e3 is protecting it. However, with this pawn on f4, that's kind of blocking and interposing on yourself, right? If you're able to see kind of one step ahead, then a move like f5 makes sense because you're simply forming a protection connection to the vulnerable piece. All right, last but certainly not least is the idea of counterattacking. In sports, you often hear the best form of defense is attack. Same thing as something like boxing, very famously, right? Counterpunching is very, very effective as a means to back your opponent off and to quell his attack. Same thing here. Now, counterattacking is a little more complicated, of course, a little more advanced, and it's going to become more and more important as you continue to improve and get better at chess. All right. So when you're first starting out, you'll be focusing on moving the piece away, protecting it, maybe capturing something. But counterattacking is very, very important to look out for. And oftentimes we get so carried away with thinking passively how to defend our attacked piece, we may miss opportunities on even better moves that involve counterattacking. So here's a classic example based on the situation that we saw earlier, where we were discussing how to properly defend this knight on c5. Okay? And we were talking about moves like rook to c8, for example, defending it, or if you want to move the knight away, a move like knight to e6 is perfectly satisfactory. While that's fine, however, you may miss the best move in the position, which is a counterattacking move. So check this out. Rook to e8. So what counterattacking means is you actually attack either the piece that's doing the attacking or a totally separate piece worth more value, right? So let's pretend you can visualize actually mentally for a second that there's a white pawn here on d4. It is attacking this knight on c5. This rook to e8 move would be a counterattack because you're attacking this queen, which is more value than this knight, which could be lost if the pawn were to capture it. So similarly here, you're doing the same thing, and on top of it, it's effective because this queen actually cannot move anywhere because that would be illegal, right? The queen can't move out of the way due to the fact that the rook would then capture the king on e1, which is an illegal move and not possible. All right. So it's important to look out for these opportunities because you can actually win favorable exchanges through counterattacking, or just develop an initiative and you maybe become the attacker as well. All right. So to wrap this video up, let's take a look at a real opening example of how a counterattack can occur very early on in a common opening position. Okay. So I'm just going to make a few moves here to demonstrate this idea. All right, so let's pretend it's this position, for example. White has just played pawn to e5 with the threat of taking the knight on f6. Now, assuming you are a beginner, naturally, and there's nothing wrong with this at all, naturally, you're going to be looking at ways to move this knight to avoid being captured, right? So you're going to be looking at options like moving the knight to e4 or g4 or any of these squares, for example, some of which, of course, will be better than others. You probably won't be looking to defend this knight, not only because it's already defended, but because you know that that trade would not be favorable to you as black, right? A knight is worth more than a pawn, so you don't want to allow white to capture this knight here on f6 for nothing else in return. Okay, so likely you will decide on the square to move the knight and go ahead and follow through with it. However, let me show you this. Here's an example of where counterattacking really opens up possibilities for you. In this position, the best move is actually pawn to d5. All right, so check this out. Here's the counterattack, the counterpunch. You are actually now attacking this bishop on c4. Okay? So in this kind of dynamic way, you're offering an even trade, but you may value the bishop a little more, or you don't want to lose time moving the knight out of the way. And so what you're saying is, okay, well, if you capture on f6, I'm going to capture on c4, and it's basically just a knight for a bishop trade, but I haven't lost time moving my knight around, and I'm happy with my position. Okay? So to recap really quickly, there are 5 possible ways and defensive techniques to defend when one of your pieces is being attacked. You can move away. You can protect that piece that's being attacked. You can capture the piece that is the attacking piece. You can interpose or block the piece that is attacking. A little wrinkle there is the tactic of clearance, where you move a piece out of the way to form a line of protection. And finally, counterattacking. All right. Those are all the techniques for how to properly defend. Good luck with the examples that go along with this video. Thank you for watching.